The F-35 is the Pentagon's most expensive weapons program, and the department relies on contractors to keep it performing as promised. But a new DoD Inspector General audit says the department isn't consistently tracking or documenting that performance, leaving gaps that affect cost, schedule, and readiness. We'll look at what the auditors found and what DoD is doing about it with Chris DePerro, Supervisory Auditor and Program Director in the Department of Defense Office of the Inspector General. Mr. DePerro, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
Let's start at the top. What did this audit set out to examine when it comes to how the Defense Department provides oversight of the contractors on the F-35 program?
Sure. The objective of our report was to assess the department's oversight of Lockheed Martin's performance on the air vehicle sustainment contract. And that's the contract that the department uses to sustain sort of the global fleet of the Joint Strike Fighter aircraft across the world. It was important for us to start this project when we did because the department was in the middle of negotiations with Lockheed Martin. And we were hoping, through our audit and through our findings and recommendations that we could provide some information to the department that they could consider or use during negotiations with Lockheed Martin, or after the contract had already been signed, maybe that's something that they can incorporate at a later date.
Was there any history here that really raised a red flag that you were concerned about going into the audit?
There's been a lot of audit work, not just by the DoD IG, but General Accountability Office and other audit organizations about the Joint Strike Fighter. So there's always been a lot of oversight over this particular program. One of the reasons we got in when we did was the length of the negotiations that were taking place for that next sustainment contract. That signing had been delayed. There were a lot of negotiations going on with Lockheed Martin. So it sort of gave us an opening to get in early and, again, try to provide some information to the department that they could use or consider since it was still ongoing.
So walk us through your findings. What really stuck out about how DoD monitors contract performance, especially in this program?
So our overall finding was that the department did not adequately oversee Lockheed Martin's performance on the sustainment contract. And I want to point out the program was monitoring performance by Lockheed Martin, but the reality was that they weren't always taking accountability or enforcing accountability on Lockheed Martin as it related to their performance. There's just a couple of areas when we talk about oversight where we felt the department fell short. And one of those was having the right type of performance metrics and requirements in the contract. And when you have the right type of performance metrics in the contract, that allows you to better hold the contractor, Lockheed Martin, in this case, accountable to those. So making sure you have the right type of performance metrics. And then the other part of that was making sure that you have the right type of structure and the right type of resources necessary to provide oversight over a contract. It's as large and complex as this one is.
It sounds like they were noticing where performance differed from the metrics, but not really doing anything about it.
Yeah, certainly there were a lot of discussions, and so it wasn't, it wasn't a case where nothing was being done. Certainly there's things that the department would address with Lockheed Martin. But when it comes to the contract itself, we were sort of limited in what we could hold them accountable to based on what was or sometimes what was not in the contract. And a good example of that is in our report, we sort of lay out a history of the different types of performance metrics that were in contracts through the years. And early on, you might have had performance metrics that related more operationally, the availability of aircraft, the availability of fully mission-capable aircraft. Over time, because of issues that they had enforcing some of those, they were ultimately taken out. And now it's really focused on primarily supply and how long it takes Lockheed Martin to provide inventory and provide supply to the fleet.
What's the real-world consequences of that change in perspective in the contract and also the gaps that you noticed in oversight?
Sure. So some of the real-world impacts really comes down to planning, to budgeting, and to operations. One of the issues that we've had in terms of the operational performance metrics versus what's in the contract is that they aren't aligned. So Joint Strike Fighter customers, whether it's the Air Force, the Navy, other partner nations, they may have very specific operational requirements again, related to how many aircraft are available and things like that. But that's not what Lockheed Martin is actually held accountable to. Again, with the current contract, they're held accountable to, in terms of performance metrics, certain aspects related to supply. There's a lot of requirements in this contract that for a lot of administrative things and reporting items. So there's a lot in there, but when you just sort of whittle it down to the accountability piece and how it relates to the real world, which is operations and the ability to fly missions, that's where we saw the disconnect.
I'm speaking with Chris DePerro. He's Supervisory Auditor, Program Director, Department of Defense, Office of the Inspector General. Let's come back to the findings and perhaps get into a little bit of the recommendations. What should effective oversight look like in a program that's as large and complex as the F-35?
Yeah, so again, as large and complex as the Joint Strike Fighter program is, you would hope that any type of oversight is comprehensive. And by that, we would expect the program to utilize sort of all the resources available to it within the department. So in addition to the Joint Program Office, that's the office that's responsible for managing the Joint Strike Fighter, they're providing oversight. It's their contract. They have all the contractual responsibilities to provide oversight. There's other organizations within the department that also help, Defense Contract Management Agency, Defense Contract Audit Agency. So there's other organizations and resources that we would hope that they would incorporate and use, and they do in the case of this contract. When we talk about best practices, not just best practices, but regulations would tell you that for a large and complex contract such as this, that you really need to take time to tailor the oversight structure to make sure it's appropriate for the complexity that this program brings. And that way you ensure that you have the right type, not just structure, but the right type of resources to provide adequate oversight. And one of the issues that we discuss in our report is that the Joint Program Office didn't effectively utilize contracting officer representatives when overseeing Lockheed Martin's performance. And contracting officer representatives are sort of your eyes and ears on the ground. So they're representatives at the bases and that sort of sit with Lockheed Martin, wherever Lockheed Martin is providing some type of service. And so we go into detail in our report of how they could better utilize those contracting officers, and do they have enough contracting officers, things of that nature, just to make sure that they have the appropriate amount of oversight.
There's been a lot of attention recently on a new executive order that argues that the large defense primes are underperforming and not being held accountable. Do you think that the findings here reinforce those presuppositions, or is it a narrower finding related specifically to the management of this program?
So our report focused solely on the Joint Strike Fighter. So I wouldn't want to comment on sort of Lockheed Martin as a whole, because obviously they do provide a lot of services and a lot of different programs to the department. But I think our report does reflect some issues that we've identified in previous reports. This contract is what's called a sole source contract. So that's where there's only one contractor that can provide the Joint Strike Fighter, and that's Lockheed Martin. And we see that with other programs, both large and small, where you have one contractor that they're the only player in the game that can provide you that asset. So in those types of environments, we've reported that it adds some complexities to the department, both in negotiations, because we can only deal with one supplier. There's not the opportunity for competition or to find other resources. In addition, we have some issues with enforcement. If we're trying to enforce something and that contractor doesn't agree, they don't have to sign things. So obviously, if that can create delays in contracting, it can create delays in operations and things of that nature. So, the sole source environment is obviously something that this program has exhibited and we've reported on in the past. The other is having the right performance metrics and requirements in the contract. And what we mean by that is any type of performance metric where you're going to hold the contractor accountable and then sometimes provide incentives to exceed, and that those incentives can come in a monetary fashion. So we'll pay contractor money to meet or exceed certain metrics. You want to make sure that, one, they're measurable, and that if you're using data from the contractor, which happens a lot in programs and as well as the Joint Strike Fighter, if you're using contractor provided data, that it's data that we can trust and rely on. Secondly, you want to make sure that those metrics are actually enforceable, and there's really not a lot of argument or wiggle room as to whether the contractor met it or not. And third, and this gets into what we were talking about, operational or performance requirements versus contractual, is you want to make sure the contract performance requirements actually support the requirements that the department is looking for. So if you ask the Air Force or the Navy, they're looking for how many aircraft am I going to have available? That's a requirement that they're focused on. That doesn't necessarily translate to what's in the contract.
How has DoD responded to your recommendations?
Yeah, so the department agreed with 6 of the 7 recommendations we made in the report. So for the 6 recommendations that they agreed to, they are taking efforts to implement things and work towards things such as a workforce study, as I mentioned before, related to the contracting officer representatives. In addition, we made a recommendation for them to better align the roles and responsibilities in the contract for those contracting officer representatives to what they're actually doing on the ground. Because we did sort of identify through interviews with those individuals that there was sometimes a disconnect on what they thought they needed to do versus what they're actually being required to do. And then one of the recommendations that we also made that they agreed to is really just enforcing requirements that are already in the contract. So, we've identified requirements where just over time, for probably a whole lot of different reasons, things weren't enforced, which the longer that went, the more issues it created, to current day. There is one recommendation that they did not agree with, and that's our recommendation to include specific operational requirements in the contract. And so they didn't agree with that. In part, their response was that now that the contract is in place, to go back and renegotiate some of these very specific operational requirements, that it would lead to long delayed negotiations and could interrupt operations, things of that nature. So we are still waiting on some additional comments from the department related to that. But part of our response that's included in the report is there are opportunities to sort of waive those requirements if necessary. So there's an agreement that the Joint Program Office has with the JSF customers, so all the partner nations, Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, they all have their requirements. And there is an agreement that they signed with Joint Program Office that said, hey, we need these requirements in the contract. And so over time, they've learned that maybe it's not necessarily appropriate for all of those to be in there. And there's a simple way to get out of it, and that's you issue a waiver. But that's something that they've not done yet. So that was simply our response is, there are opportunities for you to sort of not comply with that appropriately, and that would be to get the waiver.
What will you be watching to tell whether or not DoD's made progress against these issues?
So we're going to be looking at some of the actions that the Joint Program Office takes regarding the contracts, any contract modifications or changes to the contracts that they were to make that would impact some of the recommendations we've made. There is some program documentation that we will be monitoring and getting copies of and requesting as they develop the workforce study plan. So as they develop those results, we'll get those to see how they're implementing those. In addition, working with other oversight agencies, we're going to be following up on, are they actually enforcing some of the requirements that are already in the contract, and making sure that they're complying with that as well.
I've been speaking with Chris DePerro. He's Supervisory Auditor, Program Director, Department of Defense, Office of the Inspector General. Thanks so much for sharing this update with us on this important program.
Thank you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.